I'm going to invite Pastor Bill to come up and share the word with us.
Melissa, thank you. Thank you much. And I'll just reiterate, too, hope that many of you will participate with us in Churches Left the Building this year. I think those who've done it in the past, we've been blessed, those of us who have served, as well as the folks who we have served. I'm a little upset, though, because they didn't have any pictures of me in that video. I helped, I really did. I did, but no pictures. I guess I didn't do anything memorable, but that's okay. Continuing today our tour through Paul's letter to the Philippians, and want to share with you some things from the latter part of chapter 2, especially the last paragraph, which I think witnesses to something that we are celebrating with communion today, being World Communion Sunday, when we join with Christians all over the world participating and gathering around the Lord's table today. And to get us into the world of what's going on here, I want you to imagine that you're going through something really, really hard. Maybe it's a crisis with your health, or a marriage is crumbling. There's been some personal just failure that's really embarrassing, or you've gotten fired from a job. There's something that's really difficult going on, and you're feeling really, really down about that. You don't know what the future is going to hold. And somebody who you met like years before, and you met them just when you were at a conference, or you're on a mission trip, or it wasn't like you'd grown up with them and spent a lot of time, but you met them in a very short time, but you made a nice connection. Somebody like that you met a long time before from someplace far away, they hear about what's going on with you, they jump on an airplane, and they come halfway across the country to come and see you, and just to help you out there. I mean, would that encourage you? That'd probably really encourage you, wouldn't it? Well, Paul here is witnessing to how something like that happened to him while he was imprisoned. Let's listen to this portion of God's word, or we can see it on the screen as well, as it comes to us from Philippians chapter 2, starting at verse 19. I hope in the Lord Jesus to send Timothy to you soon, that I also may be cheered when I receive news about you. I have no one else like him who will show genuine concern for your welfare, for everyone looks out for their own interests, not those of Jesus Christ. But you know that Timothy has proved himself, because as a son with his father, he has served with me in the work of the gospel. I hope, therefore, to send him as soon as I see how things go with me. And I'm confident in the Lord that I myself will come soon. But I think it's necessary to send back to you Epaphroditus, my brother and co-worker and fellow soldier, who is also your messenger, whom you sent to take care of my needs. For he longs for all of you and is distressed because you heard he was ill. Oh, indeed, he was ill. He almost died. But God had mercy on him. And not on him only, but also on me, to spare me sorrow upon sorrow. Therefore, I am all the more eager to send him, so that when you see him again, you may be glad, and I may have less anxiety. So then, welcome him in the Lord with great joy, and honor people like him, because he almost died for the work of Christ. He risked his life to make up for the help you yourselves could not give me. Well, if I had never read this passage before, and I were kind of walking by, and a group of you talking, and I heard you talking about Epaphroditus, I would probably think you were talking about a disease, like diverticulitis and arthritis, and oh my goodness, he's got Epaphroditus, is it serious? But indeed, Epaphroditus is somebody's name. It's a Greek, a Gentile name, and it actually has a nice meaning. It means charming. Isn't that a good name? Should be my middle name, Bill Charming Hoffman, right? So he's got a really good, and Paul actually feels pretty good about him too. Look at what he says about him here. He calls him my brother, my co-worker, my fellow soldier. He's been in the trenches with me, right? and who's also your messenger, whom you sent to take care of my needs. See, the picture here, what happened, we think, and reconstruct this here, is that, the Philippians, who, again, they didn't know Paul very well because they knew him well, but he hadn't been with them long, was my point with that. He'd only been there probably about a few weeks, maybe a month or two, if you read in the book of Acts, but they had a real connection there. And so they hear, some years later now, that he's in trouble, that he's in jail. He's in prison, probably we think in Rome. And so they take a collection, they take a big offering, and they send this guy Epaphroditus to go and to take it there so that he can help take care of Paul's needs while he's there. And then he becomes, in turn, the messenger from Paul back to them. He takes this letter with him back to the Philippians, right? And so, again, this is a little more involved, though, than a trip like across town to deliver a pizza, isn't it? Actually, take a look at a gander here at what this would have involved. Here's just kind of a map of the area. If you go, Philippi, you see is kind of in the middle, way up north there by Thrace, right? Rome, where we think Paul is way over to the left to the west, okay? And if you're flying a plane, that's about 500 miles. But in that time, the only thing that flew were birds, right? And so you couldn't go that way. Even, by the way, as the minority of scholars think that Paul's in prison in Ephesus, if you look where Ephesus is, it's just a little south and east there off of Asia, they're pointing to. But that's still a good 250, 300 miles. Now, the good news is you could sail there. You wouldn't have to just walk across land. Sailing would be faster, but still, that's a long trip. Especially think about going to Rome. You got to go all the way down around there. You probably have to stop for a few days at this port and then at that port, maybe a week here. Then you got to wait for a different boat that's going to take you some of the rest of the way. I mean, this would have taken a while. Probably would have taken at least a couple of months just to get from Philippi to Rome. And then you got to be there for a little bit to visit, and then you got to get back. You can't do any traveling in the winter because the weather at that point is very unpredictable. So you're talking about being gone from home for, at least like 6 months, probably longer than that. Now, the cultural differences between Philippi and Rome would not have been maybe as big as the geographic distance because, Philippi, as we've talked about before, was actually a Roman colony in Greece. But nonetheless, Epaphroditus, we said it's a Greek name. He's a Greek guy, and here he's in this city full of all these Italians, And he's there to go see who? He's there to go see Paul, who's a Jew from Tarsus, which is way over on the other side of the empire, kind of near where it says Syria, Antioch, Syria there. It's kind of near there. And so, even though they both would have spoken Greek, that wasn't either of their first language. They had different first languages. They would have grown up very differently. And all of this, I think, is a really good New Testament witness to why we have such a thing as World Communion Sunday. Because, see, Christianity, the gospel, has from its very beginnings, it's always been a transcultural, worldwide movement. There's a number of countries in Western Europe today, and there's pockets of this in the U.S. too, that have become more focused on what they call an isolationist impulse, the idea that we got to really take care of our own, and we shouldn't be letting in so many foreigners and giving aid hither and yon and all that. Now, in terms of nations and politics, we can have a great discussion, debate, we can agree, disagree about all that if you want. We can. But when it comes to the gospel, there's no debate. Because followers of Jesus have always just seen themselves as united with other followers of Jesus across every imaginable, geographic and cultural and ethnic and language difference. And so, in sending Epaphroditus with money to take care of Paul in the church at Philippi they're acknowledging that, hey, there's a whole world out there beyond ourselves, right? A world that we can impact, a world that we can be connected to. And think about it, when Epaphroditus, when he would have come back, they'd heard all these stories about what Rome is like and what the Christians there were going through and all these adventures from the journey there and back, And then they would have also gotten this letter from Paul, right? They got this letter that's reminding them of who Jesus is and what it means to be taking joy in him, no matter what else is going on in their lives. And so even for the Christians in Philippi who themselves never left, just the sending and the return of Epaphroditus and all these things they would talk about, all these stories they would tell, it would have given them a different perspective and probably a refreshing perspective, even on their own lives, right? And on their own concerns, like whatever the equivalents for them would have been of concerns about what's going on in the stock market, and oh my goodness, that hard exam I've got coming up this week, and oh no, and what's wrong with the Steelers offense these days, And not that those things aren't important, especially the Steelers offense, right? Boy, you gotta fix that somehow, right? But the thing is, when you're part of a church community that, as a result of sending and receiving people from the wider world, is growing a heart for the wider world, what God is doing in the wider world, and allowing that to shape and impact us, well then, when you get a bad grade on a test, or you got a bad quarter in your portfolio, or your team has a bad game, it's not so disconcerting. I mean, it's still not good, but it's not devastating because you've got a bigger perspective on things, right? And so it seems to me one big takeaway here is to be continually expanding our perspective, right, on the world and what God is doing in the world. By the way, one way you could do that, you could take a course called the Perspectives Course, which has been offered around here most every January now, which is all about that. It's about what God is doing in the world. But if you don't want to sign up for an intensive course like that, just go in our Welcome Center and go by the mission committee table and find out some of the stuff that's going on in the world that we're connected to. Or talk to somebody here in the room today who's been to see some of our mission partners with Harvest Bridge in South Asia, or who's been to Nairobi with our partners in EduKenya. Or talk to some of our teens who've been to Wilmington, Delaware, which, by the way, is a very different part of the world than Grove City. Okay? It is. Then in a few minutes, when you take the bread and the cup, you consider and pray for somebody who's following Jesus in one of those places, or somewhere else in the world that you've been, or that you've been hearing about and thinking about. Well, it sounds like Epaphroditus was getting a little bit homesick, and hence Paul, sending him back. He says he was sick as well. And he didn't tell us any more of what that's about. A lot of people speculate it was the so-called Roman flu. Rome was a huge city. Rome actually, they believe, was the first city in the world with 1 million people in it. Rome in the first century. Maybe we might be missing somebody in China that was that big at that point too. But there was no city in the Western world that topped 1 million until London came along in the 1800s. So Rome in this day, in its heyday, it emptied out after that. 1 million people, think of that. It is an ancient city. You don't have modern sanitation, What a breeding ground for all kinds of sicknesses and diseases, right? Now, there's some people point out that the word ill here was sometimes used of nervous or anxiety disorders. But then when Paul says he almost died, I still think he's talking about something physical here. His overall point, though, is to reassure these folks that, okay, he's okay now, and they also want to commend Epaphroditus to them as somebody who is willing to put even his health and his life at risk, as Paul says there, for the work of Christ. You think about that. To come and serve Paul in this way would have been a real risk. Paul's been accused of a capital crime. He's a guy who's very controversial. It'd be pretty risky to help a guy like that. And what especially strikes me is that all we're told about Epaphroditus, what he did for Paul, is it says he served Paul and took care of his needs, which all the commentators say mean took care of his physical needs, like he bought and cooked his food. He took care of his clothes. He maybe dressed his wounds. And he was just kind of there to talk and listen to him and pray with him and just kind of hang out with him and encourage him. Most of what we see in this passage is just information. He's just telling us what happened. But there is one place, though, where he does kind of tell these guys what to do. Look at what he says for him to do. It says, therefore, welcome him in the Lord with great joy and honor people like him. Honor people like him. Think about, who do we honor, you know? Don't we generally kind of honor people who are exceptionally gifted, or they've won something in a competition, they've accomplished something big, or maybe they just have a lot of charisma or something? And who knows, maybe Epaphroditus had some of this kind of stuff going for him as well. But Paul doesn't tell us any of that. What he tells people to honor this man for is what? It's basically for his humble sacrificial service. Now, last time we saw at the beginning of the chapter that he's calling the whole Philippian church to that, to humble sacrificial service. Well, here he gives an example of what that looks like. And so I guess the other real takeaway that I want to leave us with here today is to call us to be honoring people like this guy. And one of the best ways I think that we can do that is by really valuing what he's honored for and seeking to be more like that ourselves. Just trying to think about everyday examples of people like this. I think about a couple of nurses' aides at a nursing home that I chatted with this week. I think about some of you moms as well. Some of you moms who, as part of caring for your kids, you set aside careers, you set aside dreams, you set aside sleep, right? Like Epaphroditus, these seem to me kind of regular old examples of the kind of humility that Paul was commending to us in the early part of this chapter. Remember where he talks about people who consider the interests of others before their own? Now sometimes you come across one of these sort of tearjerker dramatic stories about some mom or some dad who literally risked their life to save one of their kids. But I tell you what for me is just a better gauge of how much I'm really getting this humble servant thing. It is not, the hypothetical, would you take a bullet for your kid, or would you run into a burning building to save them? It's not so much that. It's more, am I willing to rearrange my schedule on a Saturday to do something kind for one of them, Or to really tune in and listen to one of my kids when I'm just tired at the end of the day from listening to a lot of other people, Or just in day out real life situations to be laying aside, my propensity to just kind of get annoyed by little things, I heard an ad on a Christian radio station for some big conference that was coming up, and they talked about some of the really exciting people who are going to be there. They said so and so will be there and so will be there, and then they ended it just with a catchphrase, and they said, and other dynamic Christian leaders who are making a real impact on our faith. And I thought, well, I'll bet that probably turned out to be a pretty good conference. In terms of keeping people awake, because the speakers they mentioned were pretty good at speaking. The dynamic Christian leaders were probably pretty dynamic, right? And beyond all that stuff, I'm sure there was some solid, helpful teaching that was going on there too. But really think about it. Who is having a bigger impact on your faith today? Some really well-known Christian leader, or the teen helper in your kid's Sunday school class? And the person who prays for you and brings you soup when you're sick? Or who drives your grandmom to her physical therapy appointment so you can be at work, Or how about the guy who came here to church this week and fixed 4 toilets? You might not think that's impacting your faith very much, but if you had come in here today and you walked into a bathroom that had a toilet that hadn't been working and flushed for a little while, that would hinder your prayers. That may make you want to say some very unchurchy words, holy, something not very holy, right? But if you have the kind of dynamic giftedness and calling that sometimes might get you some notoriety, that's okay. Don't run from that. You can embrace that. But whether or not you have a calling like that, friends, the kind of humble service that Epaphroditus is praised for here, that's everybody's calling. It's everybody's calling. And it's within reach of all of us, too. And wonderful news, friends, is that the kingdom of God is really advanced, not so much by a few superstars, as it is by a whole lot of folks, including the stars, really embracing this call to be like Epaphroditus, to be a humble servant. So will you be one? Will you be one of those? Well, let's prepare ourselves to come to the Lord's table, where, as Paul said a couple of verses earlier, where Jesus humbled himself and submitting himself to death, even death upon the cross.